I am so delighted to speak with you. Your latest book is not the first of yours that I've read, and I feel both utterly charmed by them and also so incredibly delighted with the amount of research and the amount of science that really goes into talking about like what is happiness and how do we create happier lives? How do we build happier spaces and spaces that foster community and gathering? And you start your newest book by saying that growing up Danish meant growing up with two things: design, and I will butcher this innumerable times over
Come
our
on, give it a
conversation,
go.
but hygge.
Yes,
All
well
right.
done.
Wonderful. So for those of us who are new to the term, what is hygge?
Hygge has been called many things. It's been called sort of the art of creating a nice atmosphere. It's been called cocoa by candlelight. It's been called the good life on a low budget. I think it's all of those things, but it's about sort of feeling relaxed, feeling a sense of peace of mind, feeling connected, enjoying simple pleasures in life. I often also talk about a time I was in Sweden as an example of what hygge is. And this was with a group of friends, and we had been out hiking in the afternoon and came back. I think it was in December actually, so it got dark early in the afternoon, and we came back inside. We got a fire going in the fireplace, and we had prepared a stew that we got boiling again. So those were sort of the sounds of the cabin, the fire in the fireplace and the stew boiling. And we were just sort of relaxing, enjoying a glass of wine or two, enjoying each other's sort of company in our comfy clothes. And then one of my friends said, could this be any more hyggelig, which is the adjective of the word? And then another one said, yes, if there was a storm outside, because hygge is also this feeling of being sheltered from the outside. And perhaps that's also why the book is quite timely, because I think a lot of us feel that there's a lot going on in the world. There's a lot of turbulence. There's a lot of uncertainty. And hygge is also about sort of understanding what is the difference between things I can control and have influence over and things I can't. So of course, focusing on our home is an area where we actually have a lot of influence over what goes on and what goes up and so on. So that was one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book.
And particularly now, because we're spending so much more time in our home than ever before. You know, when the pandemic started, I've worked from home for over a decade. And so I was like, I'm built for this. I am made for this. I'm going to sail through this time. And even for me, it was remarkable at how the walls just felt like they were closing in on me. And this idea that we can sort of create a space to help foster a better sense of well-being and a better sense of connection with our family and friends. It really does feel like this is the moment.
Right. Yeah, and I think it has actually been overlooked as a source of well-being, the whole sort of design, home, urban environment. Of course, the choices you and I make on a daily basis, they impact how we feel. And of course, where we live in the world in terms of countries, policies, they also have an influence over sort of our well-being level. But how your city is designed impact whether you go to work in a car, on a bike, or walk. How your street is designed influences whether you believe that your friends are neighbors. For example, if you're living in a cul-de-sac, you're twice as likely as somebody living on a through street to have dinner with your neighbors, borrow tools from them, know their first names, etc. So yeah, design matters, and the environment we put ourselves in matter. And as you say, that's even more the case now since the pandemic. We spend more time than before in our homes. So of course they impact how we feel. And I also like what you said in the beginning of the introduction, how the books are packed with science, because that's what we wanted to do with the Happiness Research Institute. I started 10 years ago. We wanted to look at happiness, well-being, quality of life from a scientific point of view. We're all trying to be happier. We're all trying to understand, how do we get to the good life? What is the good life? And we should, of course, use science to aid us in that quest. So basically, my work has to do with three questions, all on the sort of scientific foundation. First, what is happiness? How do we measure it? Secondly, why are some people happier than others? And thirdly, what can we do to improve quality of life? So once I get to solve those three questions, I can retire. It's not going to be this week, but I think we have some pretty good answers to all three, actually.
I was going to make a similar joke. I was like, so you're going to do this in 3 years and we'll all be done, right?
So Aristotle worked with some of the same questions I tried to solve 2,000 years ago. Came up, fortunately, with some of the same answers. Yeah. Yeah, I think it might continue for a few more years.
And you mentioned your role as CEO of the Happiness Research Institute. And how did you specifically come to devoting your career to this work, to understanding happiness? What was your path that led you here?
I think it was a couple of things. So the idea came to me back in 2012. At that time, I had been working for 7 years at a think tank that focused on sustainability, green cities, and that area. And one evening in the office, I stumbled upon a new report that had just came out, commissioned by the UN, called the World Happiness Report. So this would be September 2012. And I was going through the report, and it gave sort of an overview of all the developments in the academic world in well-being and happiness. And it had a ranking with, I think it was 155 countries, their national happiness levels. And all the Nordic countries were in the top 10, and in the first place was Denmark. And I live in Copenhagen, Denmark. And I thought, why is Denmark often doing so well in these livability, quality of life, happiness rankings? Because it wasn't the first time I had seen Denmark in the top spot. And I thought, somebody really should look into this. Why are the Nordic countries doing well? There should be somebody in Denmark creating a knowledge center, a think tank on happiness. And then I thought, maybe I should do that. And I hadn't thought about starting an organization before, but I really wanted to work with this field. I thought it was tremendously interesting, and I was laying awake at night thinking about all the sort of different angles you could look at happiness from, like we talked about before, how our cities impact our well-being. Food, I understand, is one of your common themes. How does the way we conduct our lives, how does our relationship impact our well-being? What's the history of happiness? So I thought there was a lot of interesting questions to look at within this field. But also back in 2012, you remember this was sort of the wake of the financial crisis. And I thought, okay, a think tank on happiness also sounds a little bit crazy and a little bit risky. And 7 years at the same place, I had a steady job, and it was paying fine. So I at first I didn't sort of find the courage. But then the other thing that happened, more personal thing, was I had a mentor I really looked up to at the company I was working for, who was 15 years older than I was. And he was sort of my role model in many ways. I think he was a really good colleague and boss. And he looked like a good husband to his wife and a good dad to his kids. So I thought, that's something to aspire to. And unfortunately, he got very ill and died in 2012 when he was 49. And many years ago, my own mother had also died when she was 49. So it was that sort of momentum mori moment where we sort of recognize that our time is limited and we have to make the best use of the time we have given. So I thought, okay, at that time I was 34. I had 15 years left until I would be 49. What if I only live to see 49? What should I spend a decade and a half doing? And I thought I can continue with this job, which is fine, but I'm not really passionate about it anymore. Or I could try and create this think tank that I just felt really passionate about. And, in a matter of a couple of months, I had quit and started out with what I thought was a good idea and a bad laptop. And I know that is going to be the best decision that I'm going to make in my career. So I get to work with some amazing people, working on some really, really interesting questions. So that has brought me a lot of joy and purpose, which is I think key ingredients in happiness.
Well, and having the opportunity to make the choice too. As someone who I also feel like I am privileged enough to make certain choices with how I spend my time in my life. It is such an incredible privilege in order to be able to choose things that make you happy and give your life meaning. And, we both live in countries, although I would say Denmark and Sweden and Norway to a far greater extent than Canada. One of the things in my background as a dietitian that we learn about in terms of health is that, there are individual aspects of health, the foods we choose to eat, whether we move our body, whether we smoke or not. But then there is also the construct and the built environment and the structures and the policies and the procedures. Are our neighborhoods safe? If we get sick, is there care? Because here in Canada, of course, we have socialized medicine, which not all countries do. But then there's also this aspect of culture. And I think that as a North American, most North Americans that travel to Europe, for example, they really can't help but notice that there's a very stark difference in how many in Europe approach life, namely that pleasure and enjoyment are a much higher priority there than here. How does hygge fit into that mindset in Denmark?
It reminds me of a letter I received from a French lady after I first wrote about hygge. I wrote something called The Little Book of Hygge back in 2016. And I got a lot of letters from readers, a lot of them saying, I've been having hygge all my life. I just didn't know there was a word for it. Yeah, but this particular French lady, she wrote, earlier I would have had an afternoon with my two kids, and we would have been on the sofa drinking some tea and eating biscuits and just sort of doing nothing. And I would have called that a lazy afternoon. Now I call it a hyggelig afternoon. And I thought that was marvelous that we sort of removed the guilt from what should be a nice activity to do with your kids, spending time with them on the sofa, giving them some a few biscuits and some tea. But I think to me, hygge is about sort of the sort of pursuit of everyday happiness. It's trying to build in some pleasure, some connection, some relaxation, some joy in my daily life. Understanding that yes, it's a turbulent world out there, but I can control what's for dinner tonight, and I have influence over what's the atmosphere going to be around the table. And I also often like to tell about the story how the idea for my new book, My Hygge Home, came. And that was actually a Canadian guy that sort of sparked that, because he had read about hygge, and in hygge there's a lot of focus on lighting and creating the right atmosphere. Danes use a lot of candles to create that atmosphere. So he went out and he bought some candle holders, and he started to light candles for dinner at home with his family. And him and his wife, they have three teenagers, sons. And at first, when their dad started to light the candles, the teenagers, they started to tease him. Dad, what's going on with the candles? Should we leave? Do you want to have some romantic time with mom? But he told me, eventually the boys, they actually became the ones that lighted the candles for dinner. And most importantly, at least to me, he said, our family dinners now last 15 to 20 minutes longer, because the difference in atmosphere around the table changes how the boys act. So instead of just sit down, shovel down their food really fast and then leave, they sit down, they sip their wine, and they talk about their day. And you're a dietitian, and my favorite diet advice, and this is one of the official French diet advices, is that you should eat together.
Yes.
Right? You should eat together with other people. And that's also what I wanted to do with the book. I wanted to understand how to get more dinner time together. And yes, more home cooking. I'm a big fan of cooking. I'm a big fan of home cooked meals. It's also, I can see what a lot of people say that takes a house and turns it into a home. It's cooking, it's the smell of food cooking, it's family dinners, it's having people over for dinner, it's the sound of laughter. It's not about things, it's about connection. And the meal is such an important, I think, arena for all of that. And I'm sure you're familiar with these studies, but you can see teenagers who report they often have family dinners, report a stronger sense of belonging, report better grades, lower obesity levels, better communication skills. So there's a lot of the goals we have, I think, for our sons and daughters that we can actually accomplish by putting food on the table, home cooked food, and having a conversation without our phones. It's one of the areas where we don't have technology invading so much in the conversation.
I'm such a stickler in my house.
I forget what the question was. I forget what the question was, but
you've answered it
on a rant.
beautifully.
I went on a rant about the importance of home cooked dinners.
But that's exactly it is this idea of daily pleasure, and there's so much that I want to say about this, and there's so many aspects of this that I want to pick out. I will say the first around family dinner in my own home. I'm such a stickler for family dinner and no technology at the dinner table, because it is that sense of connection that we're all in a million different directions every single day, and this is our opportunity for 20 minutes to sit together, to see each other for the first time in a relaxed manner where we're not off to an activity or trying to get something else done. Like, what a gift. And, I know that my children who are 12 and 7 at this point, they see it as a chore. They're like, I don't know why she's making me do this. But, it's this idea that, we need to come together as people on a very human level, because very quickly that's being taken away from us, particularly with technology. And I see it in my children. My oldest was old enough to be, sort of like away from technology for the first 5 years of their life. They couldn't even turn on the TV by themselves until they were 5 years old. Whereas my youngest is digital native. My parents, and it was always my parents who were swiping their phone in front of her and teaching her how to use a phone from a very young age. And there is this idea that if they are not with technology, they're waiting for their opportunity to be with technology. And so family dinner is just such an important thing for me.
Right.
In order to say, no, it's the people that matter. It's these relationships that matter. It's this time in, the real world that makes us feel good. The other thing that I find so interesting about, in particular, this book, is that because we spend so much time indoors, like 90% of our lives indoors, you mentioned, which is shocking to me. How do our homes contribute to our health and happiness, sort of in a general sense?
The short answer is 15%. So we did a large study in 10 European countries at the Happiness Research Institute. I think it was 2018. And we looked at that exact question you're asking. What's the relationship between our homes and our overall happiness? And we can see that our homes and our satisfaction with our homes explains roughly 15% of the variance in happiness levels. And 15% at first might not seem like a lot, but think of how many factors influence your happiness levels, from your health to how happy your kids are, whether you're in a relationship, to income levels, to genetics, age. There's a lot of things that goes into where you are on a scale from 0 to 10, if you want to use that sort of metric of happiness. So having something that has influence of 15% is quite a bit. And there's a lot of things I want to say to what you're saying now, because we there's the whole sort of not ancient, but Churchill said, we shape our buildings and then they shape us. And we have a lot of evidence of that, besides from the study we did at the Happiness Research Institute. Now, you mentioned your kids. What was the oldest?
12.
12. So yeah. There is a study called the UK Millennial Study that have followed, I think it's 12,000 kids that were born in the year 2000, and see under what circumstances do they grow up in, and how are their health and mental health and well-being in general. And if kids have a TV in the bedroom at the age of 7, those kids that have a TV in the bedroom 4 years later, not when they're 12, but when they're 11, they have a 25 higher risk of being obese, just because of one thing in their bedroom. So I think, yes, that's, we can see 15% overall happiness levels, but we can also see just one thing actually has an influence over your physical health, at least when you're a kid. So I think that there's a lot of things we are not aware of, and that's what I wanted to do with the book. Not saying that one thing is right or wrong, but just being mindful of how will the design and the choices you make in your home impact your health, your mental health, your well-being. Actually, coming back, I want to come back to the to the family dinners, because
please do.
You mentioned technology, and in the book I talk about why we should always, a lot of us often eat artichokes. I'm a big fan of artichokes. One, they're delicious. You're probably more, you can tell me if I'm right, but I assume they're quite, good for you in terms of health.
They absolutely are. Yeah.
Good. And thirdly, they are very quick to prepare. So less than a minute, half a lemon in boiling water, salt the artichokes, and then you boil them for 40 minutes. So you have 40 minutes to go around, clean up your house after your 2 kids, right? But they're quick to prepare, but it gives you a long time to eat, right? It takes a long time to eat because you have to peel off each leaf when you eat them. And me being a nerdy numbers guy, I of course measure how long our family dinners are. And when we have artichokes, they're 12 minutes longer. And it just occurred to me when you're saying the thing about technology at the table, artichokes, when you need both hands to eat artichokes with, so no phones.
Genius.
Right? So it's not the season now for artichokes, at least in Denmark, but soon. So.
Well, and it's all of these little moments. And one of the things that I value about your writing is that this isn't something that is inaccessible. It's all of these little moments. It's all of these little changes. Even coming back to your story about the candlesticks, I have 2 children who love to bicker with each other. And that's one of the things that I have to say, we'll cut our family dinner short because mom and dad just get tired of it.
Right.
And I was like, we need something to shift the energy here. And for us, it was music. We're a huge music household. And so I would put on a playlist, some bossa nova, not pop music, not things that my kids would listen to, but bossa nova or some jazz. And I turned it on relatively loud, not so loud we couldn't speak, but enough that it could not be ignored in terms of like another personality in the room. It is incredible how that changed things.
Yeah.
Just having that music set the tone was remarkable for us.
Well done. And it would be really interesting to do, sort of academic studies on this. Now we have one data point, your family, because it made me think of a PhD study that was done in a Danish primary school, where they tried to change the lighting in some of the classrooms. So instead of having the sort of white overhead light in the classroom, I'm not sure what the word for it is, but they had lamps that were sort of above the tables. We call them pendants. Is that what it's called?
Yes, we call them pendants too.
Pendants in some of the classrooms. And they could observe that the kids, instead of being, as kids sometimes are, crazy rolling on the floor because there's light the same way anywhere in the classroom, they were sort of moth to a flame. The pendants, the light, the pockets of light, the pools of light drew the kids towards the tables. And they measured the noise levels in the classrooms and found that where they changed the lighting to this setting, it dropped to, I can't remember the decibels, but it was equivalent going from the conversation level you have in a noisy restaurant to the conversation level noise-wise you have at home. So a noticeable difference in noise. So light will have that influence, and I think it's a good bet that music, calming music, will have a similar influence on kids. And it's this area I wanted to explore and bring some light to. No pun intended. But I think it's overlooked in happiness research and sort of in our lives in general. I think a lot of us think that our well-being levels and how we feel are not constant, but not influenced by the place we are at. And I think that's incorrect. And I think a lot of your listeners will be familiar with, you walk into a room and you just feel sort of, this is a nice place. Your shoulders drop, your breathing changes. And then some rooms will give you the opposite effect. And I think we should lean into that and understand, why is it that I feel a certain way in some rooms and a different way in others.
And I'm so glad that you mentioned light, because I was very shocked to see the statistic in your book that in one trial, people were at 40% greater risk for depression if their homes lack natural light. So I live in Canada, you live in Denmark. Housing is becoming untenably expensive.
Right.
And so many of us may not have, a great choice about where we live and may not have access to the kind of light that is best for us. What can we do if we're living in a dark little apartment? What can we do to combat this and add, if not more daylight, it's just more light to help create that atmosphere?
Yeah. 15 years ago, I was selling Christmas trees with a friend of mine. We did that for a few years. It was a lot of fun. We bought a couple of hundred trees and sold them in a small square in Copenhagen in December. Pro tip: it's a great month for selling Christmas trees. But it was December, like it is in Canada, the shortest days of the year. And when I came back, I was doing it when I was at university. When I came back to school after that sort of Christmas tree selling period, people would ask me where I had been on vacation, because I had built up a tan. Because suddenly I was standing outside several hours a day. And I know we live in northern countries. I know we don't have a lot of light in December or November for that sake, but there's still light to be had. So I think the advice is, yes, it's cold. Yes, it's darker, but it makes even more sense this time of year to get out as much as we can, or at least for an hour every day, going for a walk. I think it also makes, when we then come home, it makes it more hyggelig, and it makes it more sort of okay to be at home, because now we have been out. So I think that would be my advice for those people living in the smaller, darker apartments, getting out in the winter time as well, and harvest a bit of daylight we can get. But you're right, and the study you're referring to, I think it was a World Health Organization study, and I think even more radical was the pilot study that was conducted at the main hospital here in Copenhagen, that looked at when they had patients in the hospital that were dealing with depression. They spent more time in hospital, I think it was 59 days compared to 29 days, when they were in the north-facing rooms compared to the south-facing rooms, because we get more light from the south. So I think, you know, it's being debated whether seasonal affective disorder is a thing, but I think it's beyond discussion that daylight matters for our well-being, and making sure we get some even in the darker months, I think is important.
And fresh air as well. And, I know from my side of things that, simply opening the window changes the microbiome, the microbes that are in your home. So this idea that, we can quote unquote progress so far, we can do so much with technology, we can do so many things, but we are still animals who require daylight to reset our circadian rhythms, who require fresh air in order to support our immune systems, to support the microbial world around us. Like we really can't get past that.
Right. And of course, I mean, your other question, what can you do if you're living in a small apartment, dark? Well, if you had an endless budget, some would say get a skylight, and of course, none of us can afford that necessarily. But one of the reasons why Danes enjoy painting their walls white is that it reflects the light better, so it travels further into the room, or using mirrors, right, to bring the light that do come further into the room. So I think even on unlimited budgets, there's still things we can do. I should also clean the windows we have, actually. I think that's the cheapest thing you can do to add instantaneously more light to your room.
Yeah.
But now it's 5:30 in Copenhagen, where it's dark already.
It's pitch black. I know. So in Vancouver, my own family lives in a very small bungalow, and we spend most of our time in just over 800 square feet, which I had to look it up, because even though we're in Canada, for some reason, we give space in square feet. So it's 75 square meters.
Okay.
It's like, I feel like I have to look this up and be a good metric person. And we have a lot of stuff now that we have kids. I feel like I'm constantly battling clutter. And in your book, you talk a lot about this notion of not necessarily space, but spaciousness, and a sense of spaciousness and happiness. How does that actually contribute? I mean, I know as soon as I look at this cluttered house that I cannot rest until I've done something about it. So what do we know from like an evidence perspective of like why we need spaciousness in our homes?
Yeah. I was happy to see in the study with the 13,000 homes that size or square feet or square meters is not the best predictor of whether people are happy with their homes or not, or happy in general. But spaciousness did predict something. So we asked about both things, how big their homes were in square feet or square meters, but also how does it feel in terms of spaciousness. So having a cluttered home, we could see, was actually the best predictor whether people were unhappy with their homes. But it doesn't have to be a big home. It just has to feel like there's a lot of space. So yes, decluttering your home can be a great strategy if you already have a lot of stuff. But in the book, I also talk about what I think is even better, and that is sort of pre-cluttering. So not bringing unnecessary things into our home. Because I think we have an unfortunate tendency to buy things that perhaps does not necessarily make us happy in the long run. And that's a general theme in marketing. I think, Don Draper perhaps said it best in the TV series Mad Men: advertising is about one thing, happiness. And there's a lot of companies out there who are trying to tell us, if you buy this product, then you'll be eternally happy. And unfortunately, there is no one thing that we can acquire that is going to fulfill that promise.
And, I love that you focus on that so much in the book, that you explicitly state that creating a sense of hygge is not about buying stuff, because I do feel, particularly in North America, we're always assuming we can buy our way to better. Like, why would
Right.
I sleep? I'm just going to drink these fancy energy drinks. And, it backfires all of the time. And I would love to get really specific about the activities that sort of create that sense of hygge. Like for me, it is absolutely, and you mentioned this before, this making a cup of tea. I didn't have a lot of time this morning, so I made a cup of coffee because we have one of those like little fast machines. But making a cup of tea means you're boiling the kettle. That takes a few minutes. You're putting the tea in the tea bag. It has to steep. That also takes a few minutes. It's this little sense of ritual in my day that just slows everything else down. Like, what are some other things that we can do to create that moment in our day?
First, I want to say I think you're right. There's been too much focus on furniture and what to buy. In the book, I also talk about hygge washing. I think when hygge exploded globally, there was a lot of companies out there that were quick to say, this is the most hyggely glass you can ever get, and etc. And Danes will sort of object to that, because to us, hygge is not about things. And I remember I think it was an American journalist who called me and said, okay, if I want hygge, what's the first thing I should buy? And I said, well, okay, something obviously went wrong in translation. So I'm glad you're raising that question. And I think now I worked with happiness research for 10 years, and it's still those three basic questions I mentioned before that I'm working on. But there's also a sort of fourth one growing, and that is, how do we decouple wealth from well-being, and where do we find happiness that doesn't come with a price tag? I think that's a super important question to ask as societies. How do we get bang for our buck, GDP converted to well-being, quality of life for our people? But also at the personal level, where do I find enjoyment that doesn't cost anything? What gives me happiness that doesn't cost anything, in an attempt to remove the power that sometimes money can have over us? I think what makes Copenhagen, one of the things that makes Copenhagen a great city, is that the water in the harbor is so clean that in the summertime I can go swim in it. And I can do that whether I'm rich or poor. It gives me a lot of quality of life. After work, go down for a swim, meet with my friends, have a few beers. And yeah, okay, our summers last for about 2 days, but those 2 days are amazing, and then it's back to winter
Great
again.
days.
Right, great days. And I think that's a good tip to give to your listeners. Try and notice, even write down, what are activities that I've enjoyed that doesn't cost anything. And ideally, they could be activities that also check the ABC list for mental health that we sometimes use in Denmark. So ABC stands for act, belong, commit. So doing something active, doing something together with other people, and doing something meaningful. And what that could be would be, for instance, during the pandemic, I went to a forest with a group of friends. So we could spread out, but we were still hanging out together in the forest. And we were out in nature. We were together, and we were looking for edible mushrooms. So active and doing something together, and doing something meaningful. So activities like that, I think is very important to be mindful of, to help us understand that we can find happiness without spending a dime.
And, I would add to that that happiness is probably best served without spending a dime, you know? And I love this idea that you could create a little list. You could get cozy under a blanket on a Sunday morning and make a little list. Like, what are those moments, like getting cozy under a blanket on a Sunday morning, that make me happy? And you can keep them somewhere. And if you realize that a day is not going, it's not going your way, this is not the feeling you want to have, you can refer to that list. You can call a friend, you can go for a walk, you can take a bath, you can remind yourself of all of these things that we do have access to, that are not about achieving something or buying something.
Exactly. And I mean, my last book was called The Art of Making Memories. And there I looked a lot at, why we remember what we remember. And, memory works through association. So having that list, or having things that remind you of the things you enjoy, is a good way for you also to do them again. Speaking of lists, I just want to share another tip from the book. I think is perhaps also especially relevant for your listeners, and also the time we're in right now, with the sort of cost of living going up, at least in Denmark. I'm sure that's the case for Canada as well. Yeah. Food is getting more expensive. So in a lot of families, people throw out food worth more than 1,000 Canadian dollars each year. And I'm really interested in reducing that, because hygge is also about making do and not being wasteful. It's basically what our grandparents did, right? Sort of to make do and be frugal and enjoying the good life on a low budget. So two things I do, and that I've written about in the book. So I always keep a list of what I have in the freezer on my phone, because then when I'm at a supermarket, I can always check what do we have. And for example, on days like this, when I'm having a conversation with you while I would be otherwise making dinner, I knew earlier today, well, we have borscht, which is a Eastern European soup, in the freezer. So I took that out a few hours ago. So that's what we're having for dinner tonight. So it makes my everyday easier to have that list and know exactly what I have in the freezer. And another thing I do, talking about design and food, is in my fridge, or in our fridge, we call it a retirement shelf. So it's one shelf where you keep all the food you need to eat in the next day or two before it goes bad. So it's the most visible shelf you have in the fridge, and it just triggers your memory of, okay, I need to work that eggplant into dinner tonight somehow. Yeah. So instead of having something going bad behind the strawberry jam in the top shelf, and you find it too much for now, and then you have to clean the fridge, keep it on the same shelf, keep it very visible, and that will reduce food waste.
I'm just thinking about my fridge right now and thinking, oh, I could use a retirement shelf right now. It is a hazard, because I do develop recipes for a living as part of my work. So yes, okay. Some inventory management, I feel like you've just bested the dietitian on inventory management. So well, I know what I'm doing later today.
And so let's exchange recipes then. I guess my artichokes is not really a recipe; it's an ingredient. But can you give me advice? What would you cook that you think gives a lot of eating time compared to cooking time?
Oh, that's a great question. I feel like I probably have never thought about that before. I mean, instantly I'm just thinking about things that are very tactile, things that I'm doing with my hands. And I feel like I feel like artichokes excel at that, because I think that's one of the only foods that take a long time to eat in that way. So much of what I'm plant-based, and so much of what we eat are stews and soups and like very cozy sort of one pot things that are actually very efficient to eat. Yeah. I feel like that is a challenge, and I'm going to have to think about that.
All right.
And maybe come up with a list, like how to extend meal times, foods and meals that extend meal times, because you've got me stumped.
I think, and I think, like Vietnamese fresh spring rolls
Mhm.
also, because then you just have to chop up the different vegetables, right? And then your kids and spouse and yourself, you build it yourself. So I think that adds also. But yeah, it takes longer time to prepare than the artichokes.
It's
But
true.
basically, we want to get people to work at the dinner table and not at the kitchen table.
Exactly. As soon as you said that, of course, to do a fresh salad roll, anything that you are actually preparing yourself. So the components are there and you're picking and
Yeah,
preparing is really helpful. Yeah. Or eating berries. Berries for dinner would be wonderful without an ice cream, because then people are just one by one
right.
picking that up. I love that. Okay. I can't help but notice how much this conversation really sort of equates to living with intention, which ultimately requires us to slow down. Given the nature of your work, given the importance of your work, the fact that you run this institute, how do you achieve balance sort of achievement in your work with cultivating this sense of intention and slowing down and like ultimately like a hygge life?
Oh, um, I say no a lot. Um, I think there's only so many hours in a day and only so many hours in a week, and I'm in a fortunate position where people invite me to do all sorts of stuff, and I've found that if I say yes too often, then that diminishes my sort of overall well-being and increases my stress levels. So I try to keep work um, at a level where I don't get too much on my plate, uh, and try to delegate. Um, and then I I think I go back to that sort of decision I made 10 years ago when I started the Happiness Research Institute, is instead of focusing on sort of the income level of something, then focusing on, would I enjoy doing this? And I know that's a very privileged thing to be able to ask that question. Um, but in 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 the career I've had, I've been more successful when I've done things that I really enjoyed than when I was doing things for profit, for salary. So I try to turn it around a little bit and say, okay, what would I actually like to do, and then we'll figure out how to make that work financially. The Happiness Museum is actually an example of that. I thought it would be really fun to create a museum around happiness. It wasn't a great business case, but I just enjoyed really much to create a museum where you could look at sort of the history of happiness, the science of happiness, the politics of happiness. I got my dad on board. That helped sort of renovate the space we were doing the museum in, and that was a real joy to be able to work with him on a project. And now it's there, and fortunately, post pandemic, we also got the financial ends to meet. So that is now so generating some income for the institute. So I try to ask different questions, and that automatically slows things down for me and makes the things I then do more enjoyable.
Thank you so much for that. I'm wondering, have you read Essentialism? Just with what your answer was then.
No.
No, so Essentialism is a book that all those things that you describe are something that I'm working on in my own life, being able to say no more often, to not stretch myself in a million directions all of the time. So I just read this great book called Essentialism, which talks about exactly that. You need to say no most often. No needs to be your favorite word in order to maintain control of your life, but also to move far in the direction that you do choose. So I love that. This is the perfect place to switch to the rapid fire. I end every episode with 5 rapid fire questions, just little bits, little fun bits. So if you haven't read Essentialism, what's the best book you've read this year, or audiobook that you've listened to?
Oh, this year, the best book is a Danish one called Meter i sekundet, meters per second. A Danish author called Stine Palgaard, who writes about a woman who moves to the part of Denmark that resembles in many ways the part I grew up in. But she just captures the interaction that people has in those places superbly. So she had me laugh out loud several times. But it's a fiction book.
Beautiful. I'm a huge fiction reader. I love that opportunity to be transported into another world, into another point of view. I love nonfiction as well, but I think that we need to not forget about fiction as enriching our lives in the same way we expect that nonfiction does. Yeah. Your favorite cozy dinner. We know what you make when you want to extend the dining time. What's your favorite cozy dinner?
It's probably a stew, something that needs to boil for at least an hour. That allows me to have a glass of wine and talk with my guests while the food gets ready. And then, yeah, I'm a sucker for mashed potatoes. So stew with mashed potatoes, I'm a happy camp.
Perfect. Who wouldn't be? You have 20 minutes all to yourself. You are not allowed to be productive. What would you do?
What day of the year are we talking about?
Any day. It can be high summer. It can be the middle of winter. Whatever you choose.
All right. So if it's a spring or summer day, I would go out and I would take a nap under a fig tree we have in our garden.
Beautiful. I love that.
Maybe have a fig or two.
Yes. I have a fig tree as well, and we had a banner year this year. It was remarkable. The place that you've traveled to, because of course, as North Americans, we often travel to Europe and we say they've got it so right. They know how to live. What is one place that you've traveled to that you think gets it so right in terms of happiness?
I think a lot of places get some things right in terms of happiness. It was I think it was my second book, at least in English, called the Little Book of Lykke. I actually look at what are countries, places, cities doing right in terms of improving quality of life. And I think every city has something. But I think if I had to choose a place that is not Denmark, not Copenhagen, that would be good for me and the life I enjoy, I would probably go for a place like Amsterdam. Very bike friendly, very pedestrian friendly. I like cities where I can get around human powered instead of being stuck in a car. And sort of compact cities that offer some interesting architecture. Yeah, I think those are key ingredients for me in a good city.
Yeah. I love that. Okay, final one. What is one wish that you have for yourself or the Institute in the coming year?
In the coming year, ideally, perhaps not in the coming year, but in the years to come, I think it would be great if we could find a location where we could fit in both the Institute and the Happiness Museum, because now we're in 2 different locations. But I think it would be amazing if we could gather all activities under one roof and sort of have the activities spill a bit more over on each other.
Amazing. Thank you so much for this conversation. Just one of the many things that I value about your work is that simply engaging with your work is part of what creates the mindset and the shift that you want more in your life. Like both the Art of Making Memories, your recent book, My Hygge Home, as you read it, it's forcing you to have that intention about happiness, about how
I'm
you
happy to
create
hear
your
that.
space. And I notice it trickle out immediately. So I just know that listening to this podcast is going to help so many people create more intention around choosing happiness and cultivating happiness in their own lives.
Yay. I'm happy to hear that. Thank you, Desiree.